Welcome to another episode of This Month in Mormon Studies, your monthly recap of the goings-on in the news, blogs, book releases, and events related to the field of Mormon studies. This show is co-sponsored by Kofford Books and the Mormon News Report, and co-hosted by Brian Whitney and the affable Brandt Malone. Brandt, you just had a birthday this week.
I did just have a birthday. I am a spry 33 years old. So I know that there's quite a few people who are older than me that keep telling me, oh, you know, it gets worse every year that goes on. But I'll tell you what, I woke up on my birthday and it was I felt every single one of those 33 years on my body.
Well, Brent, you wear not quite older than dirt pretty well, I have to say. Well, let's get into the recent news.
Okay, so first of all, Nyla McBain, author of Greg Kofford published Women at Church and founder of the Mormon Women Project, revealed a new Sunday school supplement on her website, mormonwomen.com, for this year's study of the Doctrine and Covenants. The supplemental material offered is focused on church history from a women's history standpoint, and articles written by multiple women's history specialists are now available that complement the gospel doctrine lesson schedule.
These Sunday school supplements are fantastic, and I really hope that that Sunday school teachers will take the time to take a look at her website and to see ways to incorporate these women's voices into their Sunday school plans.
It seems like people are talking a lot more about LDS history just in this brief little bit in the context of LDS Sunday school curriculums, more than years past and more than other versions of Scripture. So it's really interesting to see this. It's almost a newfound enthusiasm and focus on LDS history from a more scholarly perspective than other years.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that we have the Joseph Smith Papers team to thank largely for that, as well as kind of the updates that they've been trying to do here and there to curriculum. Speaking of the Joseph Smith Papers, they released a new video titled First-Hand Accounts of the First Vision, which discussed the four main accounts that were either written or dictated by Joseph Smith. This video features editors from the Joseph Smith Papers project, including Jed Woodworth, Karen Davidson, Mark Ashurst McGee, and Stephen C. Harper. It's a 4-minute video that would make an excellent resource to be shown in seminary or Sunday school setting. You can download it right from the Joseph Smith Papers website, and we'll include the link in the show notes.
More people are getting into additional accounts of the first vision. So one could say the effort that the church history department and the Joseph Smith Papers have put in getting those first vision accounts out there, it's being utilized in some Sunday schools. Now, granted, I've got a self-selecting group that I'm looking at, but it's more than I've seen in the past. In non-church history news, a video was released by The Atlantic titled Where We Stand that was created by Paper Bridge Films. This 20-minute documentary follows Abby Hansen, a stay-at-home mom turned vocal advocate for ordained women. According to The Atlantic, the women in the film battle threats of excommunication, harassment, and a shifting worldview as they reconsider what it means to be a Mormon. We'll include a link to this documentary in our show notes. Brian, I'm not sure if you've heard much about this. I've heard whisperings of this for a while, and it sounds like it's getting there, and it surprises me that we haven't heard more about it, mostly because it was such a huge part within Mormonism that I think people are going to, for better or for worse, they're going to talk about it for years and years to come, the influence that ordained women had within the LDS community. Right,
and I did watch this 20-minute documentary, and I thought it was very good. It was very it was touching. It was thought-provoking at the same time. And I think the most important part and why we would include this in a Mormon Studies podcast is because this really is more broadly the kind of stuff that people are going to be looking at, whether it's looking at contemporary studies within Mormon studies, cultural studies, or down the road in the future. They may be looking back 20 years from now at the episode of Ordained Women, as much as we do, like, for instance, the September 6 events from 20 years ago. The forthcoming February issue of the Ensign, the official magazine of the LDS Church, will include an article titled Understanding Church History by Study and Faith, written by Keith A. Erickson, the director of the Church History Library. The article focuses on the fragmented nature of documented history. Erickson stated, "Today we learn about the past through incomplete pieces of history. As we study these records, we must remember that they do not represent the entirety of the past." Another point Erickson made in the article is that people attempt to put the pieces of the past together in order to tell a story. The article is already available on the church's website, and you can find a link in the show notes.
It's really interesting that we're starting to get to a point in the LDS Church where to understand to fully understand LDS history, which includes the good and maybe the not so appealing, you've got to understand this process of history. Are people going to take that step? or are they going to want the LDS Church to do all the work for them, which has been common in the past?
Right. I think that this framing is super important. We're lucky within the LDS Church that we actually have quite a bit of documentation of our past, and part of that comes from the very beginnings of the church, that we were commanded to write things down and to keep a record of things. And so because of that, as far as religion is concerned, we're fairly robust in our documentation. Like I said, we're so fortunate to have the things that people decided to leave behind. What about all the stuff that people didn't leave behind? The stuff that people didn't take the time to write down and didn't, archive in some way or another and pass it down through their generations and then ultimately donate it over to a professional archive, right? There's still so much out there that we're missing.
In some really sad news, Mormon historian B. Carmen Hardy passed away on December 21st. Hardy was the author of Solemn Covenant, the Mormon Polygamous Passage, that was released by University of Illinois Press in 1992, and Doing the Works of Abraham, Mormon Polygamy, Its Origin, Practice, and Demise, by the Arthur C. Clarke Company in 2007. The latter, Doing the Works of Abraham, being a part of the Kingdom in the West series. Benjamin Park, our wonderful buddy and one of our favorite listeners, wrote a touching tribute to him at the Juvenile Instructor that you can see in the show notes. Solemn Covenant was probably one of my first books that really exposed me to a more scholarly version of Mormon polygamy and trying to look at it from that lens. It's always going to be one of the more influential books. I got really lucky when I bought it on Amazon. I got a signed copy, which was really cool. But yeah, we definitely lost a really good one.
So moving on to the blogs, following up from last month's review of 2016 releases in Mormon history, Benjamin Park, once again, blogged at the Juvenile Instructor, looking ahead at the release schedule for 2017. Books that he highlighted included Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's A House Full of Females, which we'll be discussing later in this episode, D. Michael Quinn's long-anticipated third volume in the Mormon Hierarchy series titled Wealth and Corporate Power, Unpopular Sovereignty, Mormonism in the Federal Management of Early Utah by Brent M. Rogers. He's one of the volume editors of the Joseph Smith Papers. And Confessions of a Mormon Historian, the Diaries of Leonard J. Arrington, 1971 to 1999, edited by Gary James Bergera. And he also discussed many others. This is, as we discussed last month, his retrospective is a great way to remember what came out and to fill up your wish list. Well, this is another way to fill up your wish list going forward.
And I'll be honest, I actually use this to kind of keep track of, okay, what's going to be coming out? What can I start anticipating for? What should I be aware of? And this Ben Park guy, I mean, come on. He is so hot right now. He's all over the blogs. He's all over everywhere. That should make him feel good.
Yeah, well, and he's a sexy beast, so there you go.
He is. I mean, yeah, physical attractiveness aside, So retrospectives are always popular in January. One could say they are so hot right now. Tanya H. at the Juvenile Instructor posted a year in review where she looked at the year of 1975.
What?
Yeah. So rather than a retrospective of the most recent year, she looked 42 years in the past, which I think is just a phenomenal way of doing one of those retrospectives, and I would hope they continue it. As her primary source, she relied on a film series produced by the church titled Church in Action. She wrote, "Fortunately, most of the Church in Action series is posted online, thanks to the YouTube channel Hard to Find Mormon Videos, which is a well-curated collection of golden oldies for your holiday viewing enjoyment. And I picked 1975 because it seemed like a good in-the-middle sort of year, before the 78 end of the priesthood and temple ban for people of African descent, before the 1980 church-wide 3-hour block schedule, but well after the consolidation of the church magazines, finances, and the correlation effort was underway." It's a really fun article that is well worth the read. And I think we were talking last episode, or one of the ones in the past, about kind of the sports radio. Hey, what's one of the more influential years? Like, this is something really cool that I could totally see on a sports radio thing. If we ever decided to get like Mormon radio, it would be 1975 in Mormonism. Let's check it out. Let's dive deep into it.
Right. And Antona said in the beginning of her article that this was inspired by Joseph Stewart's challenge to look at other dates as being pinnacle years for Mormonism outside of the standard, 1844, 1830 dates. Mm-hmm. So this is an outgrowth of that challenge. Hope to see more. Speaking of Joseph Stewart, a regular contributor to Juvenile Instructor, this time though, he blogged with Religion and Politics, which is a great blog outside of the world of Mormonism. Yes, there are blogs outside of the world of Mormonism.
No.
Yeah, it's true. He blogged regarding the Mormon Tabernacle Choir's scheduled performance at President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration. This has been getting a lot of feedback, I guess you can say, throughout the bloggernacle. But
a lot of chatter.
But he did a little bit more of a historical take. The piece is titled A Note of Discord, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir at Trump's inauguration, and it focuses really on the history of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir in performing at political events. In it, Stewart observed, The Mormon Tabernacle Choir's history and national reputation roughly follow the trajectory of American acceptance of the Mormon faith. The LDS Church has been officially politically neutral since the 1890s, but its choir has performed only at inaugurations in which the president-elect won Utah's Electoral College votes. While many Latter-day Saints believe the choir is filling its nonpartisan civic duty, the group's post-election performances seem to serve as a reward for the support of the Mormon electorate in American politics. So a bit of a provocative article there, and he makes some pretty interesting observations about when we choose to perform at inaugurations and when we don't.
Christopher, a juvenile instructor, another juvenile instructor posted his thoughts about attending a recent lecture given by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich for the release of her new book, A House Full of Women. His post, titled What is Early Mormon History, wrote, I was at first surprised to see Ulrich extend that undefined period all the way to 1870. My sense is that early Mormon history has traditionally referred to that phase of the movement's existence, covering its beginnings up to and through Joseph Smith's death in 1844. He continued, I'm interested in the ways in which women's history challenges the traditional periodization of Mormon history. That is, early Mormon history will certainly look different when viewed through the eyes of its earliest female adherents. I didn't think there was that much of a contesting issue about when one would describe early Mormon history until I read this piece. And I think both Christopher and Laurel make really great points as to when it should be considered and how that dynamic changes if you start looking at, say, women's Mormon history versus other times.
It's one of those obvious slap you upside the head type of things. But he's absolutely right. And you could extend that out, which he does in the article. You can extend that out to racial history as well, and look at how they would view the periodization of Mormon history. But yeah, I mean, for somebody like me, I would have thought either Joseph Smith's death in 1844 with the succession crisis following that would have been the kind of the cutoff period into modern Mormon history, or perhaps the arrival at Utah in 1847, or perhaps the turn of the century in 1900 would have been a mile marker. But then you have to ask, well, why do we think that, and who is it that gets to decide that? And traditionally speaking, it's been us guys, us white guys who have said, well, this is the most important part of the turning of history between modern and early history. So yeah, I think this is something that I think we could really chew on within Mormon studies.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Richard Dilworth Rust, a missionary at the LDS Church History Library who's worked on the George Q. Cannon project for the last several years, wrote a guest post for, you guessed it, Juvenile Instructor. I think it's their month, titled simply George Q. Cannon Journals, where he offered some important insights gleaned from the Cannon Journals that just became available online recently. Highlights include Cannon's reflections on constitutional rights, Brigham Young, the U.S. Supreme Court Reynolds decision, which was an anti-bigamy decision, and his low opinion of the members of Congress. That was a fun one to read. The journals can be accessed at the Church Historians Press website, and a link will be posted to the show notes.
Well, let me ask you this, Brian, because you have more experience with some of this than I do. Would you say the George Q. Cannon journals being available, is that a big deal? Is that just we've had stuff before, so it's not that big of a deal? I mean, where would you rank this as far as importance and impact?
Well, I would say that George Q. Cannon is at the top of the list of those who documented things. So we're lucky to have him. And he wasn't shy about what he wrote. He wasn't shy about his opinions on things. He didn't hold back. He didn't restrain. He didn't to play the patriotic narrative or the loyalist narrative at all. He just put it all out there. So it really does give us some great insights into church history.
Which I've got to imagine from a historian's perspective has got to be refreshing, because then you're sitting there going, okay, this is someone giving us their actual thoughts and opinions on things, not writing for an audience that might read this later, so they want to make sure they put on a good face or whatever.
Right.
Nathaniel Gibbons wrote an interesting post for Times and Seasons. Ooh, so we got a different one titled Scripture and Historical Context, a Contemporary Example, where he discusses the sometimes rocky relationship between scholarship and faith. He writes, reading the scriptures literally is a proposition that makes no more sense than trying to read Robert Frost literally, since the scriptures contain poetry and a host of other literary genres that are supposed to be read in some fashion other than literal. On the other hand, much as I value and am interested in scholarship and research, I cannot take seriously the idea of handing the ultimate authority over any spiritual question to a committee of experts. He continues, my general attitude is to try and approach the scriptures as much as I can on their own terms. This is, of course, difficult and, in some sense, impossible. The scriptures are not self-interpreting, and I cannot recover the historical and cultural context in which they were originally written. This is a really insightful article that encourages its readers to value scripture as they stand while seeking to understand their context wherever possible. And I think it's something that we're not really comfortable with in the LDS faith, especially when it comes to something like the Book of Mormon. I think we got more leeway when it comes to something like the Bible, but especially when it comes to something like the Book of Mormon, we're not good with that at all. And despite the efforts of people like Grant Hardy, it's still read in a very literal sense, and it's still something that I don't know if we progress much in how we approach and interpret the Book of Mormon. I'm not sure what you think about that, Brian.
Well, in his article, he mentions the Book of Mormon and talks about how it differs from the Old and New Testament in the fact that it was actually written for a future audience, which makes it a little bit of a different read, right? So, so it is a lot easier to read the Book of Mormon outside of its cultural setting and cultural context because it wasn't really written for that cultural setting and cultural context. So scholars like Grant Hardy and Brant Gardner, for instance, they are going to spend a lot of time contextualizing passages into what the possible cultural settings, were within the Book of Mormon. But, it's a little bit different. Plus, the Old Testament is really kind of a collection of a lot of different genres. Like Nathaniel Givens wrote, some of those are their poetry, their stories that were passed down through generations and meant to just give you a moralistic tale.
But to your point about cultural context, so I think one of the downsides that you have with the Book of Mormon when you're trying to go down that cultural context road is we don't have that much cultural context.
Yeah.
Mostly because you look at like the Old Testament and New Testament. Yeah, we could actually go through and find a lot of that history that's there. We could find extraneous accounts outside of the Bible of what's going on, but we don't have that with the Book of Mormon. So I think that makes it even more difficult and might make people even more reticent to looking at it in that context because there is no other context. It's we've got this and that's it. So you got to take it at face value because we don't have anything else outside of there versus the history that we have as far as like biblical studies and being able to find things outside of the Old Testament or the New Testament.
Voting for the 2016 Terrific Wheaties Award is now open. This annual awards post is hosted by the Wheat and Tares, and it looks at categories from scholarship to humor and Mormon cultural events. If you're interested in voting for your favorite Mormon blog, podcasts, such as This Month in Mormon Studies, just saying, or Facebook community, then visit the link in the show notes and submit your nominations as a list within their comments section.
I love the Wheaties. I feel like I'm Donald Trump saying I love the Wheaties. They're probably the best award out there. No, I really like the Wheaties mostly because there's a lot of content out there which I'm not able to read. And there's some good stuff that happened in 2016, some really good writing. So moving on to podcasts, we don't often discuss other podcasts on this show. I think it would surprise most people to know that there's another Mormon podcast out there other than this one.
Are you kidding?
But listen, I was shocked when I found it too. My Mormon podcast shelf broke when that happened. But there is at least one or two that are worth mentioning. The first one was by the Maxwell Institute podcast titled Standing Apart or Reconsidering the Great Apostasy, featuring Miranda Wilcox and John Young, co-editors of Standing Apart, Mormon Historical Consciousness, and the Concept of Apostasy, which was published by Oxford University Press. Wilcox and Young join host Blair Hodges to discuss questions like, what was the apostasy? When and why did it happen? How have various LDS leaders and thinkers conceived of the apostasy over time? And is it time to reevaluate our assumptions about the apostasy? I love this episode mostly because it was something that I hadn't even considered. And if I remember correctly, I think Standing Apart, the book came out like 2 or 3 years ago. So it's not a recent, it's not something that just came out. Like it's been out for a little bit. So you could probably get a decent price, if you were to go through Amazon and buy it used or something like that. But I really liked it because the history that both Wilcox and Young get into about how the story of the apostasy worked its way into the Mormon story, and specifically how that's worked with LDS missionaries in trying to tell the Mormon story was really, really interesting. And tell me if you've experienced this or not, Brian, but it seems like I don't know if that apostasy story is being as emphasized as much as it used to be, because it used to be a huge part of at least when I was a missionary 10 years ago. I'm not sure if it's still there as much, but it is still hanging around, and it's interesting to see the history behind that.
Yeah. Well, putting on my historical hat, it seems like the more ecumenical the church had attempted to become, the less we promoted that story, right? Well, I mean, for obvious reasons, because
that's a good point.
Because it's a story that basically offends everybody else, right? Saying that they had no true authority, they lost everything. But I'll say that generally speaking, yeah, I think there's been a decline.
Right.
This book, by the way, Standing Apart, I really think it's a great book for the questions that they raise. Is it time to reevaluate our assumptions about the apostasy? And the book does. It shows its historical development. It shows its emphasis. It shows the kind of decline of that emphasis. It also shows different ways of looking at the apostasy. Kind of the way that I see it is kind of similar to the different ways that we look at the notion of a worldwide flood with Noah, right? Mm-hmm. So over time we start asking questions like, well, what did that really mean? You know, if Noah was a historical figure, was this flood localized and that was the world to him, you know, or was this something that was global? Does theology demand that it's global? Does it historically stand up? And I think the apostasy is very much in the same way. In fact, I've heard some people start to promote after this book the idea of a limited apostasy.
Your point about the ecumenical outreach is interesting because you started seeing that a little bit. I want to say like back in the 90s when we started acknowledging, well, but there were still sources of light when you take people like Martin Luther, yeah, or John Wesley, where you're starting to see a little bit of that. Opening the door to saying, yeah, there's more options out there. But yeah, this was just, it was a riveting podcast for me. And I really like the stuff that Blair and the Maxwell Institute does, even if they are another Mormon podcast. Yeah.
The second podcast that we want to highlight came from Lindsay Hansen Park, and it was just released this past week. It's on her Year of Polygamy podcast series, which is a phenomenal series, by the way. If you really want to understand the details and nuances of Mormon polygamy from its history up through current practices within the fundamentalists groups, that's the go-to place. This episode presented an interview with Brielle Decker. She was a former wife of Warren Jeffs, who was the president and prophet of the FLDS Church. He's currently incarcerated. Brielle was married to the FLDS leader when she was 18 years old. She was his 65th wife out of 78. And in this interview, she detailed her experiences in the FLDS Church, her relationship with Warren Jeffs, as well as her decision to leave the FLDS community and the struggles with actually leaving it. It's a harrowing tale, and it's filled with all the drama that you might imagine. We'll link to it in the show notes.
Let me say this. So Lindsay, her stuff on Mormon polygamy was really, really good. I don't want this to seem like it wasn't, because I actually think that she did a phenomenal job in covering a topic really in depth that other people they've covered on the surface, but I don't know if they've ever gotten as in depth as she really did. But I think that where she really hit her stride and where she's providing a hugely valuable service is all the stuff that she's been doing recently on Your Polygamy, which is focusing on the FLDS experience. Lindsay has put herself in some not the safest of positions in trying to get the stories of these women out and trying to work with the FLDS community. And I think that that's something that you only hear from a few people, because it is very difficult to get inside that community, to get those stories out. And frankly, there are some threats that go along with it. And so Lindsay has done such a good job, and I hope that she continues with it, because these contemporary accounts of what's going on, like, they're really, really valuable, especially because, yeah, there are legitimate Mormon studies tie-ins here. And I don't know if there's people that are doing it on the ground and in person as much as Lindsay.
Right. And what I'll say from this interview is that, Brandt, there's a whole different world out there within the world that we live in that we're just completely oblivious to. And the things that she discusses that were going on within her community are just shocking. So
absolutely.
I do recommend listening to it, and be prepared to be shocked.
Yep. Finally, Russell Stevenson of the LDS Perspectives podcast interviewed David Marsh, who has worked developing curriculum for the LDS Church for decades. Together, they discussed the nitty-gritty details of taking a teaching concept from its inception stage to the classroom. From the show description, from his years in teaching and writing curriculum, David Marsh dispenses wisdom about how to approach our Sunday experience in order to minimize frustration. He speaks to the echo chamber of academia and our responsibilities to seek out for ourselves the deeper doctrines of the gospel and become self-reliant learners. I've really started to like the LDS Perspectives podcast. I will say in full disclosure, they do lean more to the active practicing LDS side, but they've been able to get some really, really good interviews. And even though their perspective is going to be that of active, believing, practicing LDS members, they are starting to do some really good stuff with this. And I think that for people who would be inclined to listen to podcasts like this topic, I think it'd be very good to know how that process goes, because I think it helps to understand this is how the content makes its way into the LDS curriculum, which really does play a big factor in how the LDS community approaches and interprets a lot of things regarding the Mormon studies field.
Moving on to book releases, the Joseph Smith Papers published a nifty little ebook titled The Joseph Smith's Revelations, a Doctrine and Covenants Study Companion from the Joseph Smith Papers, as a compilation and historical study of its most earliest extant versions of Joseph Smith's revelations now found in the Doctrine and Covenants. This ebook was compiled from previous publications of the Joseph Smith Papers, and is designed for those who are looking to better understand the original context and historical background of these revelations. This study companion is meant to be used alongside the 2017 Doctrine and Covenants Lesson Manual. The book can be purchased from Amazon or Deseret Book for the low price of $10.49. Stephen Evans of By Common Consent did a short review of this book, where he said this is the kind of book that you have out on your phone while you're in Sunday school and while they're going over some of these revelations, not necessarily to read all of the original revelations out loud to the class and make yourself look good, but to kind of further deepen your own understanding and contextualization as these are being discussed. So kudos to Joseph Smith Papers for putting this out. Once again, another Sunday school tool that we can use.
Janice Johnson, a visiting professor at BYU Idaho, and Jennifer Reeder, a 19th century women's history specialist at the LDS Church History Department, published The Witness of Women, First-Hand Experiences and Testimonies of the Restoration with Deseret Book. The book offers first-person vignettes of experiences and testimonies organized by topic directly from women whose voices are typically absent from church history. An interview with the authors was posted on the blog Aspiring Mormon Women, which we will link to in the show notes.
And another thing to take a look at for this is there was a review done by Exponent 2 that took a look at this book. And that reviewer, and I don't recall who it was, they were actually really impressed by this book, far more impressed than they thought they were going to be by something that's put out in the Deseret Book title. I think that they were expecting this to be kind of a shallower, thinner, devotional track. Ends up really being a good, solid historical study that can be utilized in a lot of great teaching contexts.
So if we move on to book reviews by Brandt, we almost need to have some special jingle or something like that to let people know this is a big deal. The first book on the agenda is Bearing Witness, 36 Mormon Women Talk Candidly About Love, Sex, and Marriage, edited by Holly Welker and put out by the University of Illinois. This was a really interesting book to read, mostly because it serves as a counter to some of the more generic stories we hear about LDS marriages, LDS love lives, LDS sex lives, in a sense, although there's not that many out there. It wasn't necessarily a bad book, but what I was surprised at was that it seemed to cater to a specific type of story, which is the not so typical things that you're going to hear about an LDS marriage, LDS perceptions on love and things like that. But I was more intrigued on, okay, so who is this book actually going to be for? Who is it positioned for? I don't know if I could say that I think that this book is positioned for non-Mormons, mostly because I think it'd be important that you need to have these experiences which deal with things like an individual losing their faith, infertility, divorce, things like that, the difficulties of raising children, and how some people have a struggle, especially Mormon women, have a struggle with trying to embrace the gender role and normative stance of Mormon women just loving everything about being a mother and raising children. So it's not bad in that sense. But what I also sit there and say is, okay, so if it's for non-Mormons, what I'd like to see is more people, more traditional stories to balance that out, to say, yeah, this is going to encapsulate the entire Mormon experience. Is it for practicing Mormons? I don't necessarily know, because I don't know if that's what they want to read. Is it for disaffected Mormons? Quite possibly, but I can't imagine a university press doing it. So It's an intriguing book to read it. There's going to be a lot of faces and stories in there from people you might know, including people like our friend of the show, Stephanie Lawrenson, people like Margaret Toscano and others. So there's some interesting stories in there, but I was really intrigued and I was a little confused as to, okay, so where are we supposed to go with this next? Holly did tell me that she's going to have another book that's going to be coming out, I believe at the end of this year. It's going to be very similar, but it's going to focus on men. So this was from the University of Illinois called Bearing Witness. Really quickly, the other book that I've got on my agenda, Laura Thatcher Ulrich's A House Full of Females, Plural Marriage and Women's Rights in Early Mormonism. Brian, I know that you've heard a lot about this book. I'm going to go on a limb, and I'm going to make a bold stance. Are you ready for this?
Yep.
Her book is quite possibly my best book of 2017 and one of my most favorite books in the last 3 years. So how's that for a how-to?
Wow, that's an endorsement.
And the crazy thing was, it's not just her writing style. Like a lot of people are aware of Laurel's influence on the Mormon feminist movement. It's not just her writing style, which is really, really good, but it's this unique look on polygamy, which it focuses more on what was polygamy like for the Mormon women that lived it at the time that they lived it, like right then and there. This is a book that took her 10 years to complete. And so she said that she didn't want to focus on women who were doing these retrospectives 20 or 30 years down the road, because then you're going to interpret it with a much different way. But they wanted to look at what was the day in, day out experience as it was happening. And also, what effects did Mormon women in these polygamous marriages in Utah have on the social systems, like things, the reestablishment of the Female Relief Society or the women's suffrage movement, and the end of publicly practiced polygamy in the LDS Church? All those things are well and good, but her project really shows this fascinating first-person account, not just of what polygamy and Mormonism meant to these women, but the amazing communalism, the bonding, the solidarity that fostered. So the best thing about this book, and I'm not kidding you when I say this, you ever read one of those books where like the first like paragraph, all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm totally in. Like it's not going to be hard to get through this book. That's exactly what this book was for me. So there's my bold statement. I'm going to be intrigued to see if the rest of 2017, because we talked about some of the books that are coming out, I'm going to be intrigued to see if it lives up to the hype.
Going on to events, the Utah Valley Historical Society hosted an interesting event in December that explored the impact of the Community of Christ, formerly known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, on Utah. Seth Bryant, who is currently the historic site director of the Kirtland Temple in Ohio and was formerly the pastor of the Salt Lake City Community of Christ, hosted the event. Bryant explained that not all of the Prophet Joseph Smith supporters followed Brigham Young to Utah. Various groups splintered off after Smith's deaths. One of these groups, the RLDS Church, sent missionaries to Utah to convert Mormons there back to what they believed was the right faith. He explained the RLDS Church saw significant success in Utah in the 19th century, so much that just in Utah County alone there were 9 RLDS congregations. After hitting a high of 29 congregations throughout the state, the Community of Christ Church currently has 3 congregations remaining throughout Utah today.
2 events that are coming up that we want everyone to put on their calendars, and more information is to come on both of these. The first is from Utah Valley University, and it is their annual Eugene England Lecture. That'll be done in conjunction with the Mormon Studies Department there, and that'll be on February 15th. We'll have more information to come in the next episode, including times and who the lecturer is going to be. The second is on March 30th and 31st. That is the annual Utah Valley University Mormon Studies Conference, and the theme this year is Multicultural Mormonism. Again, we'll have more information to come as the dates get sooner.
Interesting lecture given at the University of Utah coming up on March 21st at noon. Gavin Feller, Department of Communication Studies at University of Iowa, is titling this lecture The Enamored but Ambivalent, Mormonism and 20th Century New Media. It's an interdisciplinary and interpretive analysis of Mormonism's historical relationship with new media technology. Feller plans to explore the existing tensions by examining Mormonism's approach to emerging radio, television, and internet technologies across the 20th century. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Brandt, I think a couple of months ago we had an article that we'd highlighted that touched on some of these similar themes of Mormonism and media, how media has kind of affected Mormonism and kind of the development of Mormonism as an international faith and also its acceptance within mainstream America. I'm imagining that some of those themes are going to play out here in Feller's discourse.
That's what I'm thinking too, and I think that this is probably going to be a theme that more and more people pick up on, because especially now that we've had the internet for a while, we've seen the influence that the internet's had on Mormonism. Now you can kind of start looking at all these different mediums, radio, television, and the internet. You could probably find some common themes within them, and so it wouldn't surprise me if more and more people start examining that. How did media affect Mormonism, both inside the church and outside the church? Moving on to calls for applications, the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah is proud to offer its annual fellowship in the name of Marlon K. Jensen. The Marlon K. Jensen Scholar and Artist in Resident program hosts prominent scholars with expertise in Mormon studies or renowned artists who explore their relationship between faith and art in their work. Those interested in applying for this fellowship program have until March 16th to submit a CV, plan of activities, and letters of recommendations. You can visit the link in the show notes for more information.
And to round this out, one of my favorite symposiums each year, the Church History Symposium, has already announced its 2018 program. This annual symposium is co-sponsored by the BYU Religious Studies Department and the LDS Church History Department. The 2018 program is being co-chaired by Michael McKay, who we've discussed quite frequently on the show, as he's a BYU professor, as well as Matthew Godfrey from the Church History Department, one of the volume editors of the Joseph Smith Papers. And the theme is going to explore the intersection of finance and religion in the LDS Church between 1830 and 1930. The deadline to submit your abstract for your paper to the symposium is May 1st, 2017. That's a pretty touchy subject for the church, the financial dealings, and it seems to be coming on the heels of like D. Michael Quinn's next publication.
That is curious timing,
right? Yeah. Now, when you look at the announcement for this, they're leaning more on Arrington's work in economic history of the church than they are Quinn's.
Well, and I think it says something too, the fact that the church is willing to get into, I say the church, meaning the church history department, they're willing to get into a subject like this that, like you said, was a little touchy for a long time. And I think it signals, at least from the historians department, it signals a shift in how the church is going to start approaching some of these subjects from a historian's perspective. And I wouldn't say it's embracing some of these subjects, but it's also not deliberately avoiding them, if that makes sense. Like
sure.
It's acknowledging, this is very much a part of our life. So let's get qualified historians to come in and talk about it in an appropriate context.
Now, the church did publish its finances at this point through the Juvenile Instructor magazine, and it continued to do that up until about the late 50s. So there is some good data that can be mined for these presentations that are being given for anybody who's interested in possibly putting together an abstract.
Yep. And I'll pause because I know you're going to edit this out. Yep. And there was some leaks if you really want to know some more about finances in the church.
I don't know.
We'll edit that out.
I might not. Anyway, that rounds us out for this month in Mormon Studies. Brandt, as always, it is a pleasure.
This is my monthly nerd out session, so.
No question about it. All right, we'll talk to you next week.
Okay, thanks.